And with me is Dick Steinbrugge. And we'll both say more about ourselves when we get to our section. I'm going to go first. The agenda today, though, is me talking about earthquake risk in Oregon, and it's at least on high levels. I know you heard some of it from Allison Perch, who's a key collaborator I work with, too. We've got 3 different case studies about earthquake resilience work that's really key to Oregon's post-earthquake scenario. And then a quick section at the end about what you can do at home and in your communities to be prepared when the earthquake comes as well. And I think there's plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. We'll see where it goes. 90 minutes, right? And we're planning to talk for 60-ish when we're all said and done. So I'm going to sit down and rest it. Excellent, Dick. Thank you. So a little bit more about myself. I spent my career working for the state of Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. I'm a geologist by training, and I also got the degree in environmental engineering. My specialty actually was groundwater flow, groundwater geology, hydrology. And at DEQ, I worked in all the different areas, air, water, land, doing pollution control, super fun kind of cleanup, toxic dump cleanup, studying groundwater, all such things. Water discharge permitting, pollution complaints. We'll be about that in a minute. And I'm happy to talk about any of that kind of stuff at the end of this session too, if that's of interest, and beyond the session. I'm especially involved in this now because I retired just last month, and my last big project was to start up a earthquake resilience project for fuel storage in Oregon. That's key that I'll be elaborating on in great detail in a minute. So that's my background. Hydrogeologist that adopted earthquake resilience work late in my career. And Dick will introduce himself when he gets to this section of the slides. So, earthquakes in Oregon. Are we ready for the big one? I understand Allison Perch was here, and I'm curious. Well, first, before we talk about Allison, I'm curious what all you learned about earth science and in the curriculum going through your education, middle school or high school. Or how much did you learn about the earthquakes? And what was a key takeaway? And if it's none, I understand. A lot of schools, and in my day, we started studying earth science in middle school, just a little. And then nobody talked about it in high school. It was chemistry, physics, biology. And that was kind of it. And when you get to college, if you go that route, you can start over with Geology 101, as they call it, Intro to Geology, which I highly recommend. I think everybody should understand the land they stand on. When my kids went to college, that's the only thing I asked them to do in college was take a geology class, because they heard so much from me, which they did, and I thought it was great. So I take it by the lack of show of hands, not so much background information about earth science in general. And I can talk a little bit more about that as we go. Allison, what was a big takeaway from Allison's presentation? Yes.
We really talked about how there has been a lot of progress made, but it wasn't necessarily that we got it what we needed to be. It was mostly we were kind of moving in the right direction. How we do so.
Yeah, good, for sure. And that's a theme I'll be repeating a little bit. Some of the slides I've got will overlap a tad with Allison, and I'll move over them quickly. But we can talk about questions related to that and anything else you heard from Allison when we get to the end too. So if I start saying things that remind you of stuff you were wondering about when Allison talked, please do, because it totally overlaps with the stuff I'm working on. Were there any other big takeaways from what Allison shared? Okay, well, I'm going to talk geology, just straight up geology, first off. Perhaps you've all heard the work on the Ring of Fire around the Pacific Ocean. We normally talk about it because of the volcanoes that it produces, as we see with Cascade Mountain Range and Alaska and Japan and Indonesia and all the way around New Zealand. And they also, that's happening because plates, the Earth's crust is broken up into plates that are moving around. And the big one here, the Pacific Plate, is the one of great interest for this situation. There's the North American Plate, there's little plates, there's a Eurasian Plate. Who's heard much about plate tectonics before? Some good. So you guys didn't tell me. You knew some geology. That's like the most fundamental concept in geology. You know, the plates are moving and things are happening. And the reason the Northwest of the United States is so beautiful is because it's a very dynamic environment. We've got mountains growing fast, as far as geology goes. And it's happening because the plates are bumping into each other. Sometimes they crash into each other, continent to continent. That's what's happening in Europe. Italy is on a continental plate. Europe is its own continental plate. The Alps formed a long time ago because two continents just bashed into each other and went up. Same with the Himalayas. Continental crust is lighter. Oceanic crust, the Pacific plate, is heavier. It's thinner and heavier. It's made out of basalt as opposed to andesitic things like granite. When a oceanic plate crashes into a North American plate, one goes under. But that's the subduction zone. And I'll show a slide of that in a second to elaborate. But they're all around the rim. This is a graphic made by the U.S. Geological Survey that just shows the subduction zones affecting U.S. territories, namely American Samoa, Marianas, Alaska, Cascadia, the Caribbean, Puerto Rico. But this is subduction here. Japan is subduction here. This is all subduction activity. The black dots are the earthquakes and the red dots are the volcanoes. Incredibly active. And geologists, as you may know, think in terms of billions of years. The planet is, the rock record is 4 billion years old. The planet's older than that. And we're talking about things happening here on the scale of thousands of years and less. So it's like a nanosecond, or it's less than a nanosecond. And our volcanoes, some of them are steaming and look active to a human. They all look active to geologists because it's like yesterday. 10,000 years ago was a drop in the bucket. So this is a graphic of a heavily loaded graphic of a subduction zone and what's going on. And this is kind of a high-level geology 101 part. Oceanic plate, the Pacific plate going down underneath the North American plate and literally melting. Like we're talking 50 miles deep before it melts and it's gone into the mantle. And things happen when that goes on. How much of this did Allison go over? None? Oh, good. But when the plate goes down, and these are moving. North America is literally moving. If you could stand outside the planet and look down and see how the puzzle pieces are moving. North America, as a continent, is moving to the northwest, like 2 centimeters a year, about the same speed fingernails grow, which is one of the things that I always found captivating. The Pacific plate is moving also to the northwest and turning, and it's moving at like 7 to 10 centimeters a year. So it's a couple inches a year, give or take. And then there's these microplates. The Juan de Fuca plate is a little bitty chunk that just broke off and stuck there, and it's disappearing. And it's slow. It used to be bigger, and there used to be a whole nother one, and it's all subducted and made the whole west coast. And after the little microplates get done subducting, it's for North America, it's turned into the California situation with the San Andreas Fault, where the plates aren't crashing anymore. They're moving side by side. That's the rotating thing. It's a big, actually really simplistic geometry situation, except for there's no data, so we have to do a lot of hand flipping.
Okay.
But the microplates and the larger plate eventually are being subducted down. It literally pushes up the sediments into the coast range as we know it. And it's a very different geology of the coast range rocks. No volcanoes there, it's ocean sediment and whatever else gets scraped off a plate when it's pushed underneath a continental plate. And then it melts at great depth and volcanoes form, and I'm not going to talk much about volcanoes today, a whole nother super interesting conversation. And then there's earthquakes. And there's three basic kinds of earthquakes that occur as this whole thing's going up. The really big one that we've been talking about and hearing about is when it's depicted by this orange dot, or the reddish dot, and that's when the plate breaks along this entire run. Because up here, it's hard to stick a plate under another plate and they get stuck, simplistically. And so strain builds up until it gets so great that it ruptures. And that's when we have a megaquake. No. So that's a subduction zone earthquake. That's when we're talking about magnitude. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And those happen around here every 200 to 1,000 years, and on average 500-ish years. A subduction zone earthquake. Sometimes they call it a full rip of that because the entire run from Northern California up to British Columbia fails and it shakes. I'll say more about that too, but that's a subduction zone earthquake. There's a lot going on down here that we know very little about, but there are deep, small earthquakes that occur down here too. Not trivial earthquakes, but much smaller. Every 30 to 50 years, magnitude 7. There is no magnitude 10. There just can't happen with our plates. This is 9 is as big as 9. 9.6 was the biggest ever reported. 7 is significantly smaller but damaging. And then, as you might imagine, the continent up here is under a lot of strain and it's breaking, and there are crustal faults that I'll show too. And those sometimes just give up on their own little cycles depending on the geometry of it all. And those occur, any given fault, maybe 100 years, maybe 1,000 years. There's a whole bunch of them all over Oregon. And so, we have little earthquakes a lot around here. So that's a graphic and the three main kinds of earthquakes we have. We get them all here and they all can be significant. It really depends where you're sitting, on what land, when it happens. Here's a zoom in on Portland, a radar-ish kind of image of the Willamette Valley looking north. This is the Willamette River flowing to downtown Portland. And these are three of the crustal faults I just mentioned because the continent is breaking up. We hear a lot of talk about the Portland Hills Fault and the Oatfield Fault. Those two are the reason we have the West Hills. The continent's being rotated and torn, and the land's going down on the sides, and it's going up in the middle because there's a weird pressure twisting thing happening. That's why we got the West Hills, and it makes a stark line. And the Portland Hills Fault is the one that gets all the attention because it runs right through downtown Portland. I'll show a picture. Not nearly as active as the Cascadia subduction zone. They think maybe 2 events in the past 10,000 years, so not very frequent. And it is only big enough to make a magnitude 7 earthquake. But if it happens on our watch, it's going to be big damage downtown Portland, bigger than a Cascadia event. And there's a Gales Creek fault that affects this area. That's maybe 3 events in the past 10,000 years. Whenever somebody digs a hole around here, geologists swarm in and look at the excavation because you can literally see the sediments and sometimes the movement of the faults. So this shows the magnitude situation, very simplistically. Magnitude under 2, we can't even feel when they happen. Measurements, instruments, seismometers can detect them, we can't. 2 up to 5, we can feel, but usually it's pretty minor. 5.5 is where things start to get damaging. And the last big earthquake in Oregon was 1993, a 5.6 magnitude earthquake that caused a fair amount of damage, literally cracked the Capitol Dome in Salem. And then it just gets bigger by that. Magnitude scales, there's a couple different ones, but in general, they're logarithmic, exponential, for lack of a better word, and it goes up by factors of 30. It's not a straight, it's a logarithmic scale with some other factors, but a 5.6 earthquake, the spring break quake, they called it, if we had a 6.6 event, that's 30 times more energy released. Go up one more notch, 7.6, 30 times 3,900 times energy. That's the logarithmic part of all this. Magnitude 8.6, which is a typical subduction zone earthquake, 30 times 30 times 30, 27,000 times more energy released. And the duration of the shaking goes on longer and longer as well. Short earthquake, smaller magnitude. If you find yourself in an earthquake that's going on, shaking, ground shaking, rigorous, going on for 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, you already know enough to know that that was a regional earthquake and there's major damage everywhere. If the shaking stops in 30 seconds, then you know it's a local, smaller earthquake. Not good maybe where you're at, but still less diameter. This is a list of the 4 major things that happen when an earthquake happens. The ground shakes, and literally the soil you're on, if it's loose and unconsolidated, it can amplify that shaking. So that's where a lot of building damage occurs. Just the physical shaking of the building and its connections. And a tall, skinny building might amplify and wobble worse than a short, squat building, like this beautiful building you're in here. The soil itself can literally liquefy. If it's fine-grained sediment and it's saturated with water, it's like when you're at the beach and you walk along and you see your feet sinking into the wet sand. That's it. That's liquefaction happens under your feet. You put pressure and load on it. The sand grains wiggle, the water moves, and it compacts. And the water in the sand comes out. Big problem for lowlands, sedimenty areas. That liquefied land also tends to go sideways if it's hilly, and we got lots of hills. So lateral spread is the other thing they talk about. I bet you Allison talked about those words a lot, lateral spread and liquefaction.
Liquefaction, yes.
Okay. Landslides in the hills, they can happen for a number of reasons, including earthquakes, but just atmospheric rivers like we're having now. We're in significant landslide trouble right now, just from the rain. You get a wintertime earthquake, heavy rain, landslides, huge problem. And then tsunamis. Water is moved by this continental scale, shifts, and it can create a sea wave that I'll show pictures of it in that. But that's a tsunami. It's a coastal thing. It's not an issue here in Portland, especially in Beaverton. The sea wave, it's a coast thing. And if you go to the coast, it's a big deal. Here's a depiction of the kind of micro liquefaction. This was in New Zealand, 2010-ish, I think. Literally, the sand boiled up, it liquefied underneath there, spouted up into a sand blow. And those will be all over in lowlands. And it consumed this car, just sank into the mark, just like a foot on the beach. Portland, this is a map of Portland. The red is lowlands, former river bottom, the Columbia River on the north, the Willamette River in the south. All that land is terribly subject to liquefaction. And as you might realize if you look at the map, that's where a lot of our heavy industry is, that's where a lot of our chemical manufacturing is, that's where downtown Portland is. It is some of our most complicated land, and it's our most dangerous land. Beaverton, too, has lowlands along the Fano Creek and Tuolumne River. Those lands will liquefy, too. Different scale. This is the wrap of the geology story. The geologists, we could talk more later if we want, but the geologists have done a bunch of mapping. They've mapped 40 different big earthquake events, subduction zone events, from looking at the soil over the past 10,000 years. And you can see how frequently, when we say we think they happen every 200 to 500 years, it's because of this data right here that I won't try to elaborate on anymore. Other than to say, we know the last one occurred in the year 1700s. Also a really fascinating story, but save for another day.
Yeah.
I wasn't planning to use the transitions, but there they are. And the last one was January 25th, 1700. Japanese tidal records tell us that. We didn't want to bear it until recently. So here's a summary of the deal. We get magnitude 9 earthquakes. They last 3 to 5 minutes. You know, the scrunching that I told you about, when that gives, the entire coast will go down 6 feet from where it is today. You won't notice it because you'll be on it and it'll be moving, but it'll be 6 feet lower. That's partly what brings in the sea waves. The coast range in its entirety is going to move 30 to 50 feet to the west because the scrunch is going to flatten back out. That's how much energy we're talking about. The entire coast range for Oregon, Washington, Northern California is going to move 100 feet to the west and flatten back out. And the tsunamis can be small or large depending on the geometry, but 50 feet or more. So if you're at sea level or 50 feet above sea level, you're in tsunami territory. If you're 100 feet, then it starts to be safer. Here's a couple examples of major earthquakes and just some images of the damage. I'm not going to say much more unless we have time later, but this is a magnitude 8.8 earthquake in Chile in the year 2010. A developed country, still with a lot of damage and death. They have had the biggest earthquakes ever recorded, 9.6 in 1962. That's major earthquake territory. 2011, Tohoku, Japan, major earthquake. Terrain and economic development much like Oregon, yet, and the most prepared country in the world, yet 16,000 dead because of the tsunami. At the time, I think it's better than this now, 12,000 missing, because they were really walloped by a tsunami. 90% of the dead were from drowning. The ground shook for 3 to 5 minutes. Images from Tohoku. I say all this quickly and with trepidation because it's really scary when you think about that here. But our theme today is to talk about what we've been doing to deal with that. And you can operate on a community scale, global scale, and an individual scale to protect yourself. Fire and other after effects it's not just the shaking. They literally had a nuclear power plant meltdown. That was obviously, that's the worst thing you can come up with. Fires are huge. The 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, the damage was because the city burned. Back in the day when they didn't have firefighting like we have either, and more wood structures. There was a huge article that was a turning point for preparedness in Oregon. We'll talk about the Oregon Resilience Plan in a minute. The New Yorker ran this article in 2015. If you haven't read it, you should. It's a narrative, for layman's discussion of what it's going to be like here when we get the really big one. And it lists all the things that are a major issue. And we're making big progress on a lot of these things. And we got a long way to go, like Alton said. Recovery from all of this. You've heard talk about be 2 weeks ready. That's good. That's really important because all of us, after a really big one, there's going to be no help from anybody for 2 weeks. No drinking water, no food, roads blocked. We're kind of on our own and with our neighbors. Knowing what your neighbors are doing regarding 2 week ready is a good thing too. And community, in Portland they call it NET, neighborhood emergency teams. I don't know what they call them in Beaverton. The city organizes people to team up, and they pre-position supplies, radios, stuff you might want for those 2 weeks. But don't think that's the end of the road, because the National Guard comes. Our water supply systems are going to be down for a month or more. Our electricity, 1 to 3 months to get it back up. Sewers, 6 months because of the ground aspect. That means we're going to be showering in places like this, where there's provision for community bathing and cleaning and maybe even cooking and food. So that's what's the scary part. And if we do things like you're going to hear about here, it can make things so much better. It's all summed up in a very wonky report that was kind of simultaneous with the New Yorker article. This report might be why the New Yorker article happened even. You can go into all the query administrative detail if you look up that report. That's 10 years old now, 12. There's a new one, updated version happening right now. So preparedness. Here's an aerial photo of downtown Portland with yellow lines showing the West Hills Fault. You can see, and there's a little gap in it there. Thank you. Jump. And it's downtown Portland. And there, unfortunately, all of Oregon's fuel supply goes through downtown Portland too. There's big tank farms on the river, northwest Portland, that you might not even notice them when you drive up Highway 30. If you're on the river, you notice them big time. Liquefaction, lateral spread, those are incredibly vulnerable. Oregon, and here this graphic shows where there's 13 different major oil company terminals down there. 90% of Oregon's fuel goes through those terminals. There's like a 3-day supply, 3 to 5 day supply of oil in them at any one time. It just constantly moves in. Pipeline down from Seattle, barges in, 100-year-old infrastructure, some of it. And it's going to fail terribly. And if we can harden that, make it more resilient, it will both stop an environmental catastrophe, the biggest disaster in North American history. It's going to make Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico look like a small house fire, because there'll be 13 of them, and they'll be on an estuary, not in open water, and they're going to be on the hills where there's fire going up. This shows what is in one of these tank farms, all this equipment, including docks and wharves and loading racks. All that stuff's going to break in different ways. All that has to get figured out. Like I said, biggest disaster in North America ever. This is a picture of the firefighting of one oil rig burning out in open water, which was a disaster for sure, and it oiled the whole Gulf Coast. But oiling the whole of the Columbia estuary, and also trying to fight the fire with the bridges down, the emergency responders unavailable. Forest Park. Everybody agreed we got to do something about the oil storage situation, both to prevent damage and to be resilient for the recovery. So this is the program that I was responsible for. Requires what sounds like a long time, but a really aggressive schedule to assess those facilities and propose mitigation to minimize risk, rebuild them to save the standards. It's going to take another 10 years, and it's underway. Law passed in 2022, rules 2023. Here's some early results. Nobody's proposed doing anything yet, they're studying. And these graphics now just show how much the land is expected to move. Lateral displacement over 7 feet sideways, where it's red, and lesser as you get close to the hill. The land by the water is no span. It's going to settle because of the liquefaction. The purple is land is going to go down 17 to 20 inches, literally down. And that'll break every connection, break every roadway, make everything invincible to move around. The engineers are going to have to figure out how to redesign better foundations, stuff like that. You'll hear that in a minute. Portland Airport, a second huge critical node. The Port of Portland, long before this law, was already working on this. You've seen the cool terminal building. built on cool structures. That new structure is supposed to stand. Their new gate is supposed to stand after those plates. They're proposing a runway that won't fail. They haven't done that yet, because that land up there is river bottom mucky. But they're going to make a hardened runway so that air support can bring in supplies that we need. And they've got a fuel tank farm providing all the jet fuel that they use. It's on this picture. And this little bitty dot here, they look small in this picture, but they're big oil storage tanks. All the jet fuel that the Portland Airport uses and needs. They're going to fail the way they are. That's them closer up. They also distribute the oil to the gates underground. That needs attention. And they're already approved and starting construction to build 3 new big safe tanks, deep pilings that won't sell. The ground will go down, but the pilings that they're on won't. Also, fascinating story. I've gone through the first 2 case studies. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dick, and he's going to talk to you about why we're safe right now in this building. This is the best place to be if anything goes wrong.
Thanks, Mike. So just to repeat, I used to be the executive administrator for facilities for the Beaverton School District, and I was responsible for the construction of this building and 7 other brand new buildings that were part of the 2014 bond program. So I'm going to tell you a little story about how we became acquainted with the risks that Mike talked about and what we decided to do above code requirements for the construction of this particular building as a case study. And this is kind of an example, I think, of where Oregon can move in terms of having schools help the whole state recover after the big. So very quickly, the 2014 bond program, that was a long time ago for you guys. It just seems like yesterday to me. That was a $680 million bond program passed in May of 2014, and that date is important, and I'll come back to that in a minute. It included construction of 7 brand new buildings, and 3 were for new capacity, this high school, a middle school, as well as a K-5. But we also did a complete tear down and rebuild of 4 other schools. So we had an opportunity to address the design standards for 7 brand new school buildings. So you've heard about the Oregon Resilience Plan. I happened to attend a Professional Engineers of Oregon PEO conference in May of 2014, where a presentation was made by the lead chair of the group that put together this plan. Now, again, May 2014. Remember, that's the same month that our bond measure passed. And some important resilient gaps that I might add to what Mike talked about, that the resilience plan talked about in terms of recovery, are on this slide. Notice schools, and this is in the valley. If you're on the coast, it's a lot worse, but we're here in the Willamette Valley, so this is what we were looking at. The average recovery time, the Oregon Resilience Plan estimated for schools was 18 months, and they said the goal should be 30 to 60 days, so that schools can start to resume their education missions, so parents can go back to work, so the economy can start functioning again. FEMA estimated that, and this would be Oregon and Washington all together, that some 3,000 schools in their existing condition, as estimated in 2013, would collapse or be unusable. 3,000. This is also a graphic that informed our decision making. This shows the median age of schools, fire and police facilities, community colleges between 1900 that were built between 1900 and 2000. And what's really important about that is there wasn't even an Oregon seismic code until the 1970s. So you can see how much of the inventory was built before there was a seismic code. And the risk of the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake wasn't really recognized until the 1990s. Now, this data is obviously 25 years old, and things have gotten a little better, but only a little better. And we recognize that schools are different. They're unique public facilities. They're widely, this is a map, of course, you probably recognize it, of the Beaverton School District with the colors reflecting the attendance area for the high schools. But they're the schools by their nature are widely distributed. They're walkable. If somebody can't stay in their home, they can probably walk to their neighborhood schools. So they're uniquely positioned to provide support, different from, the library or the police station or something that's kind of a one-of and doesn't have large indoor spaces like school does, doesn't have large outdoor spaces like schools do. So very different opportunity. And in our case, with our 7 brand new schools that were part of the 2014 bond program, at full capacity, they would house about 7,000 students. That's a lot of people, plus staff and visitors. And we are different. School districts are different from developers, and our risk horizon is very different. And nothing wrong with developers. You know what they do? They go in and they build something, shopping center, school, school, but apartment complex or something like that, and then a year or two they sell it. So that's their risk horizon. However, school districts keep schools in operation, as you know, for decades to decades to decades. So our risk horizon is very different than the experienced by the developer. And what the Oregon Resilience Plan noted is if their schools are not open for students, parents can't go back to work, the economy can't recover, it'll be economic disasters, besides all the physical damage. So schools have a really potentially important role in supporting the community, getting students back, and keeping everybody safe inside the building. So an important point is that the seismic code is basically a life safety code. It's not generally about property protection. And if a building is struck by a design earthquake that this building is designed for, in theory, people should be able to get out of the building alive. And that's really important. But that doesn't mean a building is necessarily economically repairable. It might mean to be torn down. And we didn't think that was good enough. With the investment our community was making in the new schools. And schools, naturally, you've probably seen it over and over again in the news, when there's a natural disaster, people tend to go to their neighborhood school. That's when they go to seek shelter. It's just a natural phenomenon. Because those schools will be in service for so many decades, the probability of the big one happening during their service life is pretty high. So we decided we needed to develop our own resilience plan based on what I learned at that PDO conference in May of 2014. So we developed the Beaverton School District Resilience Plan during 2014 and early 2015. And what we had to do was, the Oregon Resilience Plan was a call to action, but it wasn't design criteria. We had to convert the information and the risks that we had learned about in the resilience plan into very specific design criteria for our structural engineers, our mechanical engineers, and so forth. And so we based it on this high school and middle school that's at, I changed the name of it now. It's, I forgot. It was the middle school at Timberland, and what do they call it now?
I'm not as familiar with all that.
Okay, anyway, so we based it on those 2 buildings, and we had a very compressed schedule. I mean, the bond measure had already passed. The boundary adjustments to create an attendance boundary for this high school had already been set, and every student knew where they were going to be going 2017 when the school was scheduled to open, and they were coming. We had to finish on time, and we had budgets that were locked in based on what the voters had already approved. So we were very constrained in terms of our decision-making and our options because of the compressed schedule and because we had budgets. So after developing a bunch of concepts and ideas, we pulled together a whole bunch of experts. 12 Valley Fire and Rescue organization hosted for us a workshop day long, and we included experts not only from our staff, but from the architects and engineers that were designing the middle school and the high school. Critical utility providers were there, emergency planning managers, the Red Cross, because the Red Cross typically operates community shelters. The school district has not equipped to do that, and a consulting.
Tumwater Middle School.
Tumwater, thank you. Tumwater.
Thank you, Google.
And so here's what we decided for Mountainside. And I'm going to talk first about the structural system. And when I talk about the structural system, you can't really see the structural system of the building anymore. It's behind finishes on the walls, ceilings, and so forth. But think about it and as akin to the bones in a human body. I mean, it's what supports everything else. Without the structural system, nothing stands together. And so it includes the concrete foundations, it includes the steel columns, the beams, the diagonal seismic bracing. It's the physical bones of the building that keep it standing. Very important. So what we decided to do was to design the whole structural system for all of our new schools, including this one, to what's called risk category 4. Code requires risk category 3 for schools. And what that basically means is risk category 4, you apply 25% more seismic loads to the building when you're doing the design than code would require at risk category 3. And oh, by the way, that's 50% more than the standard for commercial buildings. So that's the highest, risk category 4 is the highest standard that is used. And for the non-structural components of the building, for those pieces of equipment that needed to operate after the earthquake, we wanted them seismically certified. For example, there's a big emergency generator here. So that's seismically certified, so it should be operable right after the earthquake. We also decided we were going to have emergency shelter facilities in the building. I'll talk more about that later. And in those spaces, such as in the commons, such as in the gym, category 4 design was required by our standard for all the supporting facilities. Electricity and HVAC. We decided to upsize the emergency generator from what we otherwise would have done. In this building, it's a 375 kilowatt generator, and on-site is fuel supply for 96 hours. That would be running at full capacity, which it most likely. And we also decided that it would be important to have ventilation and heating operating, and so we wired the building so that the electrical system can separately be isolated to the emergency shelter facilities. So we're not wasting electricity in classrooms that won't be used right after the earthquake. We assumed there wouldn't be any natural gas service, that the heating system would be out. We decided not to put in emergency heating if it's cold. We wanted jackets and blankets to be pre-positioned and use natural ventilation if it's hot. I've been rethinking that with the global warming that's going on, but that's what we decided at the time. For new piping on the site, water and sewer, we required restrained pipe joints. You can see what those look like to keep the pipe joints from pulling apart when the ground starts shaking and moving around. We decided not to store water on site. That's a big problem in terms of being a water supplier, and water is a perishable product, actually. So what we decided to do, though, is to plug the shelter facility spaces so they could be isolated from the rest of the building and the particular spaces that you see here, and then provide stub-out connections, and I'll show you where those are in a minute, so that if a water truck could finally get here, it could pump water into the building and serve the kitchen and the locker rooms, drinking fountains and common spaces, and so forth. And seismic bracing of the plumbing in those areas would be at category 4, so that it would hold together, wouldn't fall apart. Sewer, didn't have a solution for sewer, hoping somebody can bring in portable toilets. That was a huge problem. Sewer system will be out. Did not have a solution for that. Natural gas, the building has what's called a seismic shutoff valve when the natural gas, because, and you heard Mike talk about it, the San Francisco earthquake, famous one in 1906, was for a long time known as the Great San Francisco Fire. That's because the city burned down, because fires were started, water lines were broken, fire department couldn't put the fires out. The last thing you need is a fire and supported by a leaking, broken natural gas line in a building. So what happens is when the earthquake happens, it shakes, there's a valve that automatically shuts down at the source, providing the natural gas to the building. So it will be off automatically. Telecommunications, we think the emergency management agencies will bring portable communications. District also, at least used to have a radio system. Does it still have a radio system?
I'm sorry?
Does the district still have a radio system? I think it does. It used to.
Yeah, they just got new radios, I think, for the school, so I think they're upgrading that.
So this is what your school site looked like in October of 2015. The work was already underway to level the site, do the grading. It's 40 acres. You see the construction equipment on here? That's some of the biggest earth-moving equipment in the world, and it looks tiny to the study. So only 15, so we're moving fast. 15 months later, it looked like that. Wasn't finished yet, but that was January of 2017. The school opened in September of 2017. Look at all the cars in those two parking lots. Those are all construction workers. There were hundreds on site at any one time. Here's a floor plan that you probably recognize, your first floor plan. The spaces that we decided to designate as shelter facilities are shown here. There's the sleeping, or the commons. Thought it could be divided into an area for sleeping and an area for dining, and you know where the kitchen is. We also designated the main gym and the auxiliary gym, as well as the aerobics and dance spaces that are large open spaces as available for emergency shelter. The two water connections are shown here. One is over by the gym and supports the locker room down below. The other is by the kitchen. The emergency generator is over near the kitchen area. And somebody mentioned, and I should have thought of this because, geez, I have two dogs. When people come from the community to a shelter, they're not going to abandon their pets. They're going to bring their dogs with them, right? So what are you going to do? It's not probably a great idea to have all kinds of dogs mixing with people inside the building. And so there's a covered area with hose connections and pets. You can hose it down and keep some sort of articles of sanitary conditions there so that there's provision for pets. So what did all this cost? There's a lot of numbers there. The basic number to remember for the high school, our consultants estimated that all of these things added about 1% to the cost of the building. That's round off there. A lot of people don't believe that, but it's true. The scale changed a bit. At the middle school, it was about 1.5%. For the K-5s, it was about 2%. That's just a factor of scale. I've talked to my former colleagues about the Beaverton High School rebuild. You're probably aware that that's going on. They've said it again, it looks like it's about 1% of the cost of the building. So all this seems self-evident, but it received an amazing amount of recognition. The social, even from FEMA, you can recognize the floor plan in the FEMA document is your school. The Civil Engineering Magazine, that's the flagship publication of the American Society of Civil Engineers. The Seattle Times has written about it. You notice there's nothing here about the Oregonian. They haven't written about it. Also, the American Society of Civil Engineers publishes an infrastructure report card. And the report card is built from, the national report card is built from state-level report cards Oregon's latest one was in 2024, and it specifically addresses schools and recommends that the Oregon legislature pass legislation mandating seismic and emergency shelter designs in new schools in Western Oregon, matching what this building has. So I've been working with a group of architects pushing forward on this legislation, and the goals are enhanced seismic and resilience design for Western Oregon. That's where the biggest risk is from the big earthquake, the big one, in new schools. Not retrofits. Seismic retrofits are very important, but and they're really life safety focused, but it's way too expensive to do the things that we did in an existing building. So this would mandate it only in new construction, where it's very economical. Status of that? Well, in 2023, the House committee that introduced the bill had hearings. They were very supportive and didn't get a vote on the floor of the House in Salem.
So did that.
The 2025 session that ended a little bit ago, it was introduced into committee, but we didn't get a hearing. So we haven't given up and try again in the 2027 session. We figure we only have to win once. And then the standards will be added. So the arguments we're putting forward are several. One, when we're talking to parents, when we're talking to students, when we're talking to staff at schools, the new standards would provide enhanced earthquake safety for students and staff. When we're talking to community members who don't have kids in school anymore, if you don't have even grandkids in school anymore, the benefit they get is the potential of having an emergency shelter for all hazards, not just earthquakes, all hazards, that they can use their schools to go to after the earthquake. For those that are worried about cost, my argument is, as a 1% extra cost to the building is a very inexpensive insurance policy that covers 80, 90 years of what? One-time expense. We all buy fire insurance, right? And almost none of us ever need to use our fire insurance, but we have it. Very inexpensive insurance policy. And so it's always important when somebody is proposing something to answer the question, well, why do it now? And the reason for now is the only opportunity to do this sort of thing economically is with new construction. Don't let the opportunity disappear every time you build in buildings. So since I have the floor, I'm going to give you some advice. Remember, I was at that PBL district in May of 2014. If I hadn't been there, I might not have probably never would have connected the dots that led to the decisions about the design criteria for this building and the other 6 buildings that were in that bond program. So when your time comes, get involved in your professional societies, whatever profession you're in. Network with your peers, learn what's going on. And you will be the next generation of leaders before you know it. When you're privileged enough to have a position of leadership, for goodness sakes, lead it out. And don't be overwhelmed by the magnitude of the overall problem. This is a huge problem, but you can do something to make a difference, and find what that is and make a difference. And finally, one of my favorite quotes. Okay, more about what you can do.
Yeah, so that wraps the second chunk that we wanted to cover, but the problem and what's being done that we hope is encouraging. And we wanted to take a few minutes to talk about what you can do locally and for yourself, your families, your neighborhood as well, because it makes a difference on all levels. I can't not comment and connect back what Dick was just saying to the oil terminal thing I mentioned before. You know, there's 500 old oil tanks, some of them built literally right after World War I. And the reason it's going to take them so long to figure out what to do is because of what Dick said. How do you fix that? Or do you just replace it? Or do you just go away? And I've got to say, there's a whole lot of people that think fossil fuel infrastructure shouldn't be invested in and should just go away. It's unsafe and should be gone. The oil companies themselves are trying to face that decision. They have to pay for it. It's a big business decision. But that's why it's the next few years, and if you're interested in it, that would be a super interesting thing to follow through DEQ or wherever, about the decisions they make regarding their carbon footprint and their business opportunities going forward. You know, they only want to invest that kind of money if they're going to be able to sell oil. So that's why it's so complicated. And all the while, they got to keep the oil moving. Every 3 days, like 90% of our oil has to go through there. So you can't just start from scratch. So, warning systems. I wanted to mention shake alert. If we can't predict earthquakes. They talk about forecasting instead of predicting in the geotechnical world. You know, we know that we're coming. That's what we're forecasting literally here today. But technology's gotten to us a place where we can get maybe a 5-minute warning that an earthquake, the big one's coming. And what can we do with 5 minutes? A heck of a lot. Shut down all these essential things listed here. Literally people on the operating table. So there isn't an interruption, even when you go to emergency power that hospitals have. Get people out of elevators. Get the fire departments to put the doors up so they're not stuck down. Hopefully the fire departments are getting rebuilt themselves. 5 minutes can save a lot of lives. You could get out of the building, maybe, rather than the drop cover whole scenario once the shaking starts. So there's a system called Shake Alert. 73, you know, when the day comes that you start apartment hunting, think about that. Those buildings are vulnerable.
You know, what's also interesting about that is the more massive the building is, and brick, especially, you know, the unreinforced brick buildings, they are very heavy. And so the earthquake loads on those buildings is a lot more than on a wood frame structure, which is very light. Earthquakes put acceleration into the ground. And you remember our friend Isaac Newton, F equals ma. So if you have a certain amount of acceleration and a lot of mass, you're going to get a lot more force. So wood frame buildings like houses usually perform okay. Got to be worried about chimneys collapsing, and you got to be sure that the very bottom wood plate, it's called, of the house is bolted to the foundation. The other thing that happens with wood frame houses is they slide off their foundation if they're not bolted to the concrete foundation. But if they are, being in a wood frame house is a pretty good place to be.
And that's what you get with a 1973 plus house. That was the code, and that was written in 1973. Bolt the foundation, bolt the plate to the foundation. And that stops it from bouncing off, you know, because, you know, we're talking to 3 minutes of shaking again. And that's huge in terms of saving the structure. Probably not going to crush the building anyway, just bouncing off the foundation. That's why it's not a life safety issue, but for future use of the house, huge deal. Then all buildings by code built in Oregon, probably beyond, after 1973, have those bolts.
And that can be retrofitted too at a pretty reasonable expense.
Yeah.
What is the cost for a retrofit? I haven't looked it up in a long time. Ballparking.
It's in the thousands, I think.
Yeah.
It depends on the building dramatically and whether there's access to the space under the house and whatnot, but multiple thousands of dollars. But maybe, maybe in the 5,000-ish range, I would guess, if we're just spitballing it. Which for a $300,000, $400,000, $800,000 house fits into the reasonable category for protecting an investment. Other questions?
So what are you going to tell your parents when you get home today about what you learned? Put shoes by the bed. That's good.
That works really well because a lot of parents say don't do that now. I know I said that.
That's mainly for glass, right? Just
Yeah.
to be able to get around without cutting your feet. You don't
Yeah.
want you don't want a
And you're not-
die-hard situation.
Yeah, and it's gonna be chaos.
Yeah.
So, you know, or how do you find them? And you might not be able to get to wherever you put them in a closet.
I have a few questions, if you don't mind, just quick ones. One about, what is the plan for classrooms? Will they be used, or is it really just mass shelters, or is that be like government offices, or would they repurpose the classrooms for something?
Yeah,
There's a
yeah.
lot of space in this building.
Right, a lot of space in this building. So I'm really not up to speed on the operational plan for the shelters. In concept, the Red Cross needs to come in and operate the shelter facilities because that's not obviously in the lane of the school district or the administrators or the teachers. The concept is that at the beginning, the school would be used as a shelter. That's the way we set it up. I don't know if the concept has moved beyond that to be some sort of a command center
Yeah.
or not. I'm just not aware of that. And there clearly needs to be thought about how long it works as a shelter versus when the education mission of the school restarts. And that's kind of a policy question that needs to be sorted out. I don't know if that's happened yet or not. My focus, when I was working on this, was to get the building right, because we only had one time to do that, and then let the other details work their way out. Because if it took 5 years to figure that out, you know, not the end of the world. We hope we have decades and decades to get ready for this huge earthquake. If it happens in 4 or 5 years, we're probably all toast.
That's a quote from the New Yorker article.
Well, that was years ago, so we're past that.
We've made a lot of progress. It's striking, and that is the takeaway. Regarding what's going to happen right here, I'll make note of something called the Incident Command System, ICS. It's a federal, almost military-ish organizational structure that is activated whenever there's an emergency, small or large, and it would certainly be in place here. It's after a megaquake. It's built around the idea of a unified command. Literally, the federal authorities that might be providing support, the state authorities, the local authorities that might be providing support, they unify into one command, and they start making those decisions. Like, we're going to take these classrooms. They'll make decisions like, we're going to commandeer the fuel from these gas stations because we need the fuel. And they operate on a daily loop like that. Literally one person can be a unified commander and do something and just plan every day and do whatever they're going to do for a little emergency. The wildfires in 2020, huge mobilization they create a joint information center, and they've got a team of incident commanders, and literally it overwrites all of the other authorities around while they're in an emergency mode. It's a very powerful tool, and it can be studied. There's free training. It's a FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Administration thing. All state of Oregon managers were required in the past couple of years to take the free 2-hour FEMA 100, ICS 100 training, because they're picturing mobilizing. There's probably like 5,000 managers working for the state of Oregon. They're planning to mobilize all of the managers to do whatever, you know, maybe on the ground help, maybe budgeting, maybe accounting, maybe recording. You got to track how much money you spend so you can get reimbursed. There's a whole bureaucracy that has to follow, and it's built for all that, big or small.
So let me add one other point. The legislation I mentioned that I've been working with the group toward, it includes a passage in there that would mandate that the state resilience officer organize a group to come up with a model operational plan that would be applicable to school districts and to emergency management organizations. So hopefully, if this legislation ever gets passed, and I'm optimistic that someday it will, there will be a mandate in there to actually develop these operational plans and decide who's in charge of what.
Much of what you see like that is, in my mind, in the mode of response, emergency response. How are we going to operate in an emergency, which we desperately need. That's job one. What Dick and I have been talking about here is more preparation. And there isn't nearly so much about the preparation so that you don't have to respond. You know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That holds true here. But that's where, you know, all those emergency plans are great and essential, but the need for that can be minimized if you're resilient in the first place. That's a big take-home message.
I think that kind of leads, oh, go ahead. Go.
You mentioned that building the immediate options standards really isn't that expensive for the schools at least. Is the same thing true for other types of buildings? And if so, why are like developers resistant to building to immediate options standards?
That's exactly what I was gonna ask. Like, the big picture is, why aren't we more like Japan in planning ahead and investing now? Just your thoughts on that.
I wish I knew the answer.
I think
We need more people that think like you, who are in leadership positions in the future to change.
And the codes are improving with that in mind. And so the brand new things are better. Developers, particularly, Dick, your comment about, you know, they're going to sell in 5 years, so they're going to do the bare minimum. That's never going to go away, and their margins are crazy thin. So 1% is big to them. Seems small to people investing for 100 years, but that 1% is the difference between go no go for some projects. So really tight margins, short-term thinking is what I would say about why. And laws are helping avoid that.
How expensive overall is it to the school?
Well, don't quote me on this, but I think the final cost, if you include, so the number you saw on the slide was 100 million, and that was the estimate for just the building, because when I did that 1% calculation, I wanted to exclude from the denominator all of the on-site costs, the tennis courts and the ball fields and the football stadium. We also had to do a bunch of off-site improvements. We widened 175th, we widened Shoals Ferry Road, put in 2 signalized intersections. We even paid for a chunk of the cost of that roundabout up on Kimmer. You're familiar with that? So we were conditioned, required by the city and by the county to do all kinds of other things. And then, of course, there was the basic site development here. So I used 100 million because that was the estimated cost just of the building. And I wanted the percentage calculation to be transferable to other applications, so it's just the building. I don't, so, long way to say I don't remember exactly, but I think it was closer to, 150, 175, including all costs. I'm sure that number is available. What I just said is probably wrong, but it was a lot. Beaverton High School is like 270, I think.
So on the career front, resilience engineers is a new multidisciplinary world of engineering. There isn't one thing that you can do. Civil engineers do it, structural engineers do it, mechanical engineers do it. They even let environmental engineers do it. The huge demand, and it's only getting bigger. So for those of you interested in this kind of activity academically, professionally, think resilience engineering. I tried to hire one at the EQ. It was impossible. We have to contract them because they're all booked out. Allison, I think, might have mentioned that to you already. And think public service too. A lot of this work is being done like in agencies like mine, city planning. Geography, like you're studying in these classes, feeds so spectacularly into urban planning and city planners. There's a whole cadre of planners out there that come up with this stuff. And it can be a very rewarding career.
Thank you. Thank you, Giver. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. If you didn't pack up while we were finishing the talk, thank you, but now's a good time to do that because we have a few more minutes before the bell rings.